This is an interview with Steve Coon, a retired Iowa State University journalism professor. It's part of our oral history project for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. It's November 6, 2023. I'm Cliff Brockman, and with me is our producer today, Paul Yeager. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Well, Cliff, thank you very much. And Paul, thank you as well. It's good to see both of you, and I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Yeah. Steve, let's just start with a little personal background, where you grew up and that sort of thing.
I'll try to keep this to be relatively short. I'm an Iowa native, and Iowans have a reputation, for good or for bad, of taking what could be a short story and making it very long. So I will try to remember that I did spend some time in broadcast journalism and try to keep this to be a relatively short story. Grew up first 9 years of my life in Mediapolis, which is just north of Burlington. Then lived 2 years in Washington, Iowa, and then moved to Marshalltown, which I continue to consider as my hometown, when I started 7th grade and graduated from high school there.
Very good. And then how did you get interested in broadcast journalism?
It started when I was in high school. I was taking a speech class, and one of the things that we had an opportunity to do was once a month the students in the class would go to KFJB, the hometown radio station. We had a half-hour music and talk program. So what we would do would be describe some of the school activities at the time, and then mix that information in with some popular music. And I remember one time at that age, I thought this was clever. It's kind of embarrassing at my age now, but it was during the spring on Highway 14, which would go through Marshalltown. And on the north edge of Marshalltown, it would flood every spring. And it did at that season and at the time that we were on the air. So I made some comment about the floods in Highway 14 north of Marshalltown near Riverside Park, and now we're going to play Bob Dylan's Beyond the Sea. And so I got the same reaction that you folks just gave me. So I will move on to something else.
Okay.
But anyway, I'm supposed to continue the answer, Cliff. As I was in high school, I began to visit KFJB on a regular basis, and then I think when I got into my senior year, actually when I graduated from Marshalltown High School, and then I was working full-time in the evenings, I would go to the station, and there was a fellow who had graduated from Brown Institute of Broadcasting and Electronics, and I spent a lot of time talking with him. He encouraged me to go to Brown, which eventually I did.
So then you ended up working at WOI after that?
Well, what happened was I worked in local broadcasting in Minnesota and then in Iowa for a couple of years, decided that I was now 21 and more mature than I was when I got out of high school, and I said it's time for me to continue my education. So I started my education at Marshalltown Community College and then transferred to the University of Iowa, graduated from there, came back to KFJB for a few months, then started graduate school at Iowa State University, and I had an assistantship there at WOI Radio and Television, and that's where I really got my television start.
Okay. Any big stories you can remember from that that you might have covered?
I can't remember any big stories when I was in graduate school, but I eventually came back to WOI TV and radio as a full-time reporter. And I remember there was an incident, a series of bombings in Des Moines, and so I did a series of reports on that. But what I thoroughly enjoyed, Cliff, was covering the Iowa General Assembly for 3 years from 1973 to 1976. At that time, WOI Radio was doing gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Iowa General Assembly. And Phil Morgan, who was the news director for Channel 5 and WOI Radio, we would go down to Des Moines, and one of us would do play-by-play, if I can use that description, of the Iowa General Assembly from one chamber, and the other one of us would then be shooting video and interviews of the other chamber. It made for really, really long days, because at the end of that, and as the legislative session continued to get longer toward the end of the session, we would have to drive back to Ames, process the film. We were using film rather than videotape, and then we would cut and splice. So it seemed as if we were spending almost 24 hours a day working during the legislative session, but it was in some ways some of the most gratifying work of my career.
And then you moved to KRNT in Des Moines, is that right?
I did that right after I graduated from Iowa State and had my master's degree, and I worked down there for just a few months. And I didn't really cover any major stories, but it was a joy working with Russ Van Dyke and Paul Rhodes and Kevin Cooney, who was just a puppy at that age when I was working there. But to work with those two legendary and now three legendary Iowa broadcasters was really a joy. I learned a lot. And then I had an opportunity to return to WOI Radio and TV, specifically the opportunity to do legislative reporting, which was really my love at that time, continues to be my passion. And so I moved back to the WOI stations.
And you're still doing some legislative reporting, but we'll get to that just a little bit later. Let's go on with your career here. Then you started teaching?
Yes, I was at the Voice of America, and I got a call from a former graduate student friend of mine who was teaching there. They had an opening at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and he wanted to know if I was interested, and I was. I had been at VOA, the Voice of America, for 3 years, and I pretty much thought I had reached the end of the road of where I was going to go, at least in terms of my immediate future. I could have continued there forever until retirement, but it wasn't something that I really liked. It was in some ways the best job and the worst job that I ever had. The best job in terms of money, best job in terms of being able to say that I had reached that level of my broadcast career, but worst in the sense that the hours were terrible, the family was young, I had virtually no social life, and so when my former graduate student friend of mine called, I interviewed at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. They offered me the job, and I accepted. And it's one of those things, Cliff, as you well know, if you move from the professional ranks of broadcast journalism into teaching, what you end up doing is probably getting a salary cut in half, and that's what happened to me. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was worth it. We were in Nebraska for 5 years, and then Jack Shelley called and said, "We have an opening here at Iowa State in journalism. Would you be interested?" And, well, how could you possibly say no to Jack Shelley? And also, how could you possibly say no to Ames, which Beth and I considered then and still do as our hometown? So absolutely did the happy dance, as I think some people say, and moved to Ames and started teaching at Iowa State in the fall of 1981 and stayed there until I retired in 2004. There was mandatory retirement then, Cliff, and so my first year, from 81 to 82, Jack turned 70 in that year, and so he had to retire at the end of 82. So my first year there was Jack's last year there. And let me just say this quickly. One, it was marvelous working with Jack Shelley. He was just a great person to work with, great personality, wonderful broadcast journalist, and we who worked with him were always going to be students, whether we were team teaching in the class with him or sitting in the classroom with him. He had so much knowledge, and if we were paying attention, which I certainly did, we learned a lot. We learned a lot being with Jack Shelley. Final anecdote about that. My mother always considered Jack Shelley to be her broadcast hero. When he was working for WHO, you could get the signal, the broadcast transmissions from WHO all over Iowa. And when we were living in Minneapolis, we would listen to Jack Shelley when I was growing up. And so the year that I worked with Jack Shelley made my mother so happy. That, she said, was, you know, you have reached the peak of your career. You're working with Jack Shelley. And, you know, I think she was right.
You know, I've got a similar story only as a student. When I went and visited in Iowa State, I met Jack, and my dad was just, you know, couldn't believe that I had met Jack Shelley. He used to listen to Jack do that newscast at 12:30, I think it was back then. And then I became one of Jack's students. You know, we'll get on with your career in education in just a moment, but I'd forgotten you mentioned Voice of America back there. How did you get into Voice of America? What was that all about?
When I was working at WLI Radio and TV, I'd been there for 3 years, and I had always been interested in international developments, and so I began to pester the Voice of America. I talked with them as frequently as I could, trying to tell them, you know, I really, really, really want to work for you. And it took forever before I finally was interviewed, and then forever after that before I finally was given an opportunity. And so I was hired, and I worked there for 3 years. And one of the things that I was able to do while I was there was to take the Foreign Service Institute's intensive Spanish class. And so subsequently in my international training, that really came in to be very useful. But it was a challenging work. The writing was a little bit stilted, but it made me a better writer overall. And the journalists I was working with were just marvelous people. And of course, one of the challenges that we had was try to be as objective and as fair as we possibly could. We were the international voice, the external voice of the government of the United States. And at that time, you were not permitted to broadcast domestically. Well, now, of course, anyone anywhere in the world, whether in the U.S. or outside of the U.S., can just go online and hear the Voice of America. One of the things, let me just say this, and I'm reminded of this, Cliff, because when we've had these stories about former presidents and former vice presidents holding on to top secret information, when I was at the Voice of America, we would frequently get memos from the State Department, and some of them were classified even top secret. They were basically information background only. The State Department was trying to persuade us to frame stories in a certain way. When you're writing about the Panama Canal, write this, or bear in mind this. So we would get these memos, and the head of the Latin American desk, when I was working there, would make sure that each one of us had read them, the memos, and not necessarily the top secret documents, but we read those too. But so after we had read the memos, he said, okay, everyone has read this? And we said yes. And then he would crumble it up and throw it into the wastebasket, and we would go back to what we were supposed to be doing. But top secret memos, too often I said, why in the world is this top secret? There's nothing in here that's going to damage national security. I think someone must have run out of ink on the lower classification stamp and and just said, okay, it's the end of the day, I'm tired, I want to get out of here, let's just stamp this as top secret, and I'm out of here.
That's good. Well, let's jump back to Iowa State now. What were some of your favorite courses teaching there at Iowa State?
I taught almost everything. I taught introduction to writing, broadcast writing. I taught broadcast production. I taught investigative reporting. I did some co-teaching with Bill Coonerth in investigative reporting. He was a legendary Iowa State University professor in investigative reporting. So you name it, and I taught it. Two of the courses that I really enjoyed, one was the World Communication Systems class that talked about how communication systems, news, and information differ around the globe. And then the other course that I introduced, first as a graduate course, and eventually it became an undergraduate course, was Class, Race, Media, and Gender. And it was an examination of how the media of all forms would portray people of color, women, gender, and exactly how that portrayal might influence the audiences. And so it was an excellent class, really, really good class discussions, because frequently we would have people from those particular demographic groups and they would give their feedback. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. But I had an opportunity to teach a lot of different journalism classes and with a great faculty there. Excellent students too, I should say.
Okay. And you also did a lot of international training and teaching. Looking at your resume here with places like Brazil, Burma, Nigeria, Kosovo, Guatemala, Jordan, India, many, many more places that you did training and teaching. How did you get into that?
Well, what was interesting is that I received a Fulbright scholarship in 1984 to go to Ecuador, and our family was young enough that we were able to take our son and daughter with us. I was there for 6 months. They had to come back to go back to school in late August, and so I had an opportunity to do some teaching, and it was evening classes at a university there. And that eventually led to invitations from the Voice of America's International Media Training Center, and then from the State Department to do short-term training. And so I did end up going every single continent, and it was thoroughly enjoyable, extremely gratifying, especially when you consider, Cliff, that a lot of the journalists that I worked with and continue to work in journalism today, they, not I, have these challenges. They're working under terrible circumstances, and by that I mean oppressive governments. They're not paid very much. They're intimidated by various sources. And one of the ethical problems that a lot of them face, especially because they are not paid very much, is they often have to work 2 different jobs. And occasionally, and this is where the ethical dilemma and the conflict of interest arises, sometimes these reporters will be reporting on the same government office for which they work in their non-journalism hours. Well, when you would bring that up in classes and they would say, what's wrong with that? Where is the conflict of interest? And that would be a lengthy discussion. I remember one time when I was in Suriname, in the northern tip of South America, there was one of the participants in the workshop was a very well-known sports director and a sportscaster. And so he would be recording on these soccer teams. At the same time, he was the coach for one of the soccer teams. And so the students were saying, the participants, I should say, were saying, well, this is a conflict of interest. Aren't you giving favorable attention to the team your team that you're coaching? And he said, no, I'm absolutely fair. I'm absolutely fair. He was not able to persuade the rest of the class that he was fair. So that frequently would happen. But the other thing I want to mention is a lot of self-censorship in many of these countries. These journalists fear for their life, and rightfully so. And so if you want to write a story and stay alive after you've written it for a newspaper or you have broadcast it, a lot of times you're going to either not report that particular story, or you're going to censor it significantly so that it is frankly almost of no newsworthiness whatsoever. Very dangerous to work in a lot of these countries. I have tremendous respect for them.
Well, a little aside here, you speak 3 languages, Steve. English, of course, Spanish, which you mentioned earlier, and Portuguese. Where'd you pick up Portuguese at?
Well, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Iowa, the university had hired a freshly minted PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and they have a really strong Luso-Brazilian studies program. So she joined the faculty, and so I took 2 years of Portuguese with her. I enjoyed it so much that then I signed up for a special class, a small seminar that she was teaching in Portuguese. That was a challenge, but it was thoroughly enjoyable. And then I took an independent study class where she would give me a chapter a week from the Saturday Evening Post, Death of a President, and then I was supposed to translate that into Portuguese. And so that was a real challenge. And then fortunately, as a result of all of that work, I've had a chance to do some training, not only in Brazil, but in some of the Portuguese-speaking republics in Africa as well. So the ability to be able to speak 3 languages, at least one of them fluently, and the other 2 well enough to work abroad, has been extremely gratifying.
I can imagine that would be very helpful in some of the training work that you've done.
But sometimes it can result in embarrassments. I remember, we're going to talk about anecdotes. I'll be honest, I'm a thorough believer in full disclosure, so I'm going to share this anecdote. I was in Venezuela, and I was teaching in Spanish, and I tried to mention that one of the problems and one of the challenges that many journalists have is that they spend a lot of time with other journalists. At the end of the day, they go to their favorite drinking place and they share their adventures of the day. And so sometimes what happens is that influences some of the coverage that they're doing. And so I wanted to use the term herd mentality. And well, it didn't come out quite the way it was supposed to. It turned out to be an obscenity. And the person who was working for the U.S. Embassy said, "What?" And I said, "What?" And I said, "Did I say something wrong?" And then I repeated it. And she said, No, you can't say that. I said, "Okay." So I later discovered what it was. She didn't tell me, but someone else did. And during the break, then one of the participants came up and he was laughing and he said, I did the same thing. He said, I had a story about the appointment, the nomination, and the subsequent appointment of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan. It's K-A-G-A-N, Kagan. And he said, I pronounced it as they do in Spanish, in Kagan. And if you, anyone who is watching this who knows Spanish will realize that, no, you don't pronounce it Kagan. That's an obscenity as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I'll let others look that up. I won't say what either one of them was.
I'll check that later. Yeah. Well, we'd be amiss here if we didn't just talk briefly about the Iowa Broadcast News Association. That's where you and I got to know each other. You became the executive secretary, and I had a variety of positions with that association, everything from president to newsletter editor to FOI committee chairman, and so we got to know each other. What were some of the issues? Tell us a little about your time as executive secretary.
When I joined the faculty at Iowa State University, the two previous executive secretaries of IBNA had come from Iowa State, and so I stepped into that role, and it was thoroughly enjoyable, not only working with you, Cliff, and also sending money to you that you requested for, I hope, legitimate purposes. I was never quite certain about that. I'm joking, of course, but working with you and having great respect for the professionals who were members of the Iowa Broadcast News Association and continue to be members. I have great respect for IBNA because it has for decades worked with other statewide journalism organizations to help foster strong journalism, to make sure that the public in Iowa, readers, listeners, even folks who go online, receive quality journalism, and I think that was and continues to be an excellent organization. And so I basically just worked with you and other folks to help organize the annual convention and make sure that things ran smoothly. I never was one to participate in any of the programs. I know some former IBNA executive secretaries have done that and have done a good job. I just thought my role was primarily to make sure that people knew what was coming up, that we had good speakers, and that the programs came on and ran on time, and that the newsletter came out and was well written. And so editing that was also a joy, and the fact that I was relatively fresh from my years at VOA with really strict editors helped me do some good editing for the newsletter. But IBNA was and continues to be an important voice for quality journalism in Iowa, and I think Iowans can be proud of the overall quality of broadcast journalism at all levels here in Iowa, and IBNA certainly is part of that contribution.
Well, Steve, you've been retired for a while, and we won't say how old you are, but although I remember you telling me that some of your students are now retiring. So anyway, you have continued to be very active, and I admire that. One of the things that you've done since you retired was to produce a documentary, half-hour documentary, video documentary, about Herbert Hoover and the radioactive 1927, which at first seems a little odd, I guess, until you talk about the importance of that. What was that documentary about?
Well, Herbert Hoover was a successful businessman. He lived to be around 90 years of age, and the only bad patch that he had was the 4 years when he was president. Other than that, if you look at his overall history, he was just a marvelous man, extremely successful businessman. During World War I, when he was working in Europe, as a businessman for an international mining company, he negotiated with both sides of World War I to make sure that food and necessary supplies got to civilians. In some ways, not that different from what we seem to be hearing and reading about trying to help folks who are stranded in Gaza today. So Herbert Hoover was very instrumental in saving Europe from starvation, if you will. And then he became Commerce Secretary. And one of the things that he did, he was very proud of his ability to look at problems and say, well, this needs to be standardized and this could be more efficient. For example, at the time that he came into office as Commerce Secretary, automobile manufacturers ordered their tires individually, company by company, to specific manufacturers because there was no standard size for tires. And he said, this doesn't make any sense. Let's make this standardized. And he did. And there were other examples of that. Radio was beginning to come on the air, literally and figuratively. When he was Commerce Secretary, he recognized it was going to be a major industry of tremendous good and value to the American public. And so at the time that he came into secretary, there was no regulation. There was absolutely no laws that said how much power you can have, what frequency you can operate on, those kinds of things. So there was just mass interference as all of these amateurs were taking to the airwaves. And he said, let's see if we can fix this. So he organized a series of 4 radio conferences. And unlike today, he actually got all of the parties who were interested in this to actually meet and talk together civilly and peacefully. And they agreed to a set of policies. And then the effort was to promote those, get them into Congress, get Congress to debate them, and then pass the Radio Act of 1927. And that was the first major piece of broadcast legislation in the United States. And so he deserves great credit for that. So it was fascinating. I thought, wait a minute, this is Iowa's only president, and he was involved in something that I have a tremendous interest in the radio. And I said, well, let me learn more about it. And I was going to write a book, and I said, wait a minute, I'm really a broadcaster. Why don't I do a documentary? And I got some really excellent cooperation. And Cliff, again, thank you for being one of the persons who made some recommendations and edited the original script. And so that, I think, helped improve it tremendously.
Well, that's very kind of you. You are also covering, it's almost time for the caucuses here in Iowa, and you have been out covering political candidates as they come through Iowa. We have so many of them. You're out there with your camera and your microphones and still covering these events. You're also covering the legislature still. You put up a weekly report when the legislature's in session. And you have all this, there's some other videos you do, I know, that you put on your YouTube channel that you have. What keeps you going and doing that sort of thing? Why do you keep reporting?
Well, my wife says that too. Why do you keep recording? I think I'm a masochist in some ways, but I love politics, absolutely love politics. It's been a passion of mine forever. I think one of the things that I enjoy doing with these presidential hopefuls as they come through central Iowa is that I try to go to these major gatherings that they have, record them. Now, I'm not competing with the private sector. I'm not trying to compete with any of the radio or television stations throughout Iowa or the newspapers or anyone who is doing journalism online. I'm simply doing it in a way that I enjoy doing it. I post it on YouTube for only those folks who might want an expanded discussion, if you will, or coverage of a particular debate. So I kind of let the candidates expand on some of the kinds of things that they're doing. So my reports would go longer than the stereotypical 90 seconds of a television report, or an even shorter report perhaps on radio. So it's really a hobby. It's really an opportunity to travel around central Iowa, see what the candidates have to say, see what the citizen reaction is. It keeps me busy. It allows me to continue to do editing, shooting, doing some production, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I'm going to do one more. I'll attend the GOP caucuses on January 15th, and then I will basically record video of that, and then I will post that, and then almost immediately after the caucuses are over, then the Republican presidential hopefuls will move on. They'll leave Iowa, and so that'll be the last in that series. But I've enjoyed it.
Let me ask you just a kind of a deep think question, as I would call it. What do you see as the challenges for journalism, particularly broadcast journalism, going forward here?
I think in terms of broadcast journalism, one of the difficulties that we have is that there are so many competitors out there that it's becoming increasingly more difficult for broadcast journalists to carve out a niche, a portion of the viewing audience that they can appeal to. I think the cable news networks, in my opinion, have hurt broadcast journalism. They are taking sides. They've become most basically political mouthpieces for either the left or the right. And so if you watch either the Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, you really need to go to one of the other ideologically oriented cable newsrooms to get a balance. I don't think the balance is there from either one or the other. I think you have to go to multiple outlets to get a real balance. So I think what's happening is that it's becoming more and more difficult for audiences to trust the media. Well, who's telling the truth? And I think that's one of the challenges. Now, I think the major problems, Cliff, are really at the network or national level. I think local journalists, especially here in Iowa, continue to do a good job. But they are under pressure to do increasingly more with less resources. And so when you have fewer staff and you have more newscast and you have more stories to report, it just becomes increasingly more difficult to do the kind of quality work that the public deserves. One of the expectations, which I don't like, I'll be absolutely honest about, and that is that reporters are expected to blog, to post opinions on social media. I think that is a bad idea. I don't want to know what a particular journalist feels about a particular issue, but when he or she is expected to then go and do a blog and post observations on social media, I think you run the risk of revealing an ideological bias that, in my opinion, damages your reputation and subsequently hurts the reputation of the organization that you work for. I think that's one of the challenges.
One last question here, Steve, now. What would you like to be remembered for? What would you like to have your legacy be, both professionally and personally?
I hate the term legacy, but I thank you for asking that, because I think a lot of us, as we get older and realize that we have fewer years ahead of us than we had behind us, think about that. To me, in absolute honesty and sincerity, I just want people to think that Steve Coon was a nice person. I had a workshop with him, I was in class with him, and he taught me some things that really helped me in my career and in my life. I'm a better person because I knew him. It's as simple as that, nothing more. Don't want any rewards, don't want a lot of money. I just want people to think that they are better because they knew me. I certainly am better because I've known them.
Well, Steve, we've got to wrap it up here, but thank you so much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed listening to your experiences and your anecdotes. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cliff. It's always a pleasure visiting with you. Thank you again for the invitation. And if you want to take the time to look up that Spanish word, you can share that privately with me. But thank you again. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
I'll do that. Once again, for our viewers then, I'm Cliff Brockman with Paul Yeager, and this has been an oral history interview for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting with Steve Coon. Thank you again, Steve.
Thank you, Cliff.